basically, the first question I would like to ask is why? Why do we have to teach our students a global history of graphic design? Is it to broaden their visual and cultural literacy? Is it for them to study contemporary global design practices and developing their own visual language? Is it to find past and present role models that relate to their work and are not limited? Or for them to understand every culture has a different design history and its own design history that is interconnected with the global design community? How do we do this? How we decide what is worthy of teaching and studying this topic? How can we pick and choose between all of these resources? Also, how to create an effective global history of graphic design syllabus? How do we put all of these together in 15 weeks? How we jam it up, and how do we expand it or narrow it down? How do we frame global histories? What is it going to be in there? What is missing? What is included? What is excluded? Is there a canon of graphic design history? Are there important themes to consider when teaching global graphic design history? Is there an existing list of past and present pioneers or key influences in global graphic design history? Just to give you an example, this is an example from Meg's History of Graphic Design in terms of what is missing. This is in the area of my expertise, graphic design in Iran, Iranian graphic design history. And in Meg's book, we have the Middle East section, and then the graphic design in Iran. And towards the end of Meg's History of Graphic Design, we can talk about Meg's History of Graphic Design later and discuss it as one of the sources. But just to take that example, graphic design in Iran is basically a list of certain designers, mainly all male designers from a certain generation. So the examples are here. We have Mumayez with an example of his work, which is not the best example. And also we have Majid Abbasi, Reza Bedini, Said Meshki, which all of these three designers are from the same generation. So this is not reflecting really the graphic design in Iran, and not even like different generations and different voices. And what is missing definitely are the women designers, Iranian women designers, Taraneh Mohebi Taban, Parisa Tashakuri, Homa Delvarai, and a lot more designers that are not included here. So this is a very, very small example of what is missing and excluded. Now, the question of who is qualified to teach global graphic design, history of graphic design? Are we supposed to be historians, scholars, designers, and teachers? And also, the most important thing is, who are our students? Who are we teaching to? What is their backgrounds? What is our background that we are relating to our students? So it is our audience also. Who are we teaching? And who can help us? Where to look for help? Which resources to use as a help? What books to use? Are there essays that are helpful? Can we use interviews? Can we invite guest designers, contemporary guest designers? Are there any films related to the topics that we are teaching? Can we use museums and libraries? Are there any visual archives that we can go to? The basic text for graphic design history has been Meg's History of Graphic Design. And this is like an evolution of this book. It is called A History of Graphic Design versus The History of Graphic Design, which it is interesting because this tells us that this is one perspective. It is A History of Graphic Design. And also it changed to Meg's History of Graphic Design. So maybe this is History of Graphic Design according to Meg's. And then there are all other books that we have here, not enough. some of you may have used some of these resources. I just put them up for you to see how old they are, how relevant they are or not. And there are also other resources like archives of graphic design, visual resources, also wider perspective to world history of design, just design in general. And I just found out about this book, which I have to take a look at it, but this had the title of Global Graphic Design History. And this also, I found Teaching Graphic Design History by Stephen Heller interesting and helpful in terms of reading about other perspectives and approaches. What else? I just found out through this summit that there is a public archive, People's Graphic Design Archive, which I found very interesting. And I think that's a good example of what else we can do to contribute. And I am also proposing maybe creating an open timeline of graphic design, history of graphic design. This is just an example I found off the internet, but just to use as graphics. But this can be definitely a beginning of a very rich resource that each expert in our area or culture can contribute to this timeline, and having this timeline up to date and relevant and inclusive. So ideas, please share anything that you have in mind to share in terms of adding to these ideas and suggestions. That would be wonderful. Please do share. And again, I want to thank you, AIGA, and all my fellow panelists and the people who made this happen. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and we'll open it up for discussion on our panel. So Dori and Angela.
Hey everybody, it always takes me a minute to find my mute button. You'd think after all of the Zooming I've done, that would not be the case. So I'm really excited to hear what everyone is up to. I've been teaching graphic design history for quite a while now, and I've taught in a bunch of different contexts, everything from an introductory first year non-majors survey to graduate seminars. So I've done a lot of experimentation. I've kind of come to the conclusion that really being equitable and inclusive means throwing away the canon. I know that makes a lot of folks uncomfortable, but it's a decision I was faced with, and I decided I was going to give it a try. No one died. It was okay. So that's kind of where I am, thinking about ways to make sure that my students get to explore the stories and the histories that are really important to their practice, and how I can do that and open up our conversations as a group in the classroom, so that everyone has a chance to share what they're interested in and passionate about. And finding resources can be really hard sometimes. So I'm excited to hear what resources everyone else has been using.
Angela?
Well, you know, I always have taught design history as sort of an intersection of culture and design. And that includes a lot of things. That includes your personal background, that includes the technology of the day, that includes the popular culture of the day, like what was happening in the culture, in the world, in the news. And I think that when we can connect the dots, that's how we make a story. And in terms of throwing out the canon, I think we should blow it up, you know. I'm just, you know, it's not the whole story, and the dots are all there. We just have to sort of connect them in different ways. One of the things that I do on the first day of class is I have the students bring in something that represents their culture. And I don't define what that is, and then we talk about it. So some people bring in food or clothing or their favorite music, and we look at all the different ways that you can reshuffle culture. And so I kind of think this atomized approach to teaching history is where we should be looking. And frankly, I wasn't taught history that way, so I'm learning along the way. The question of who's going to teach us, I think we just have to reach out and find those people and bring them in as guest speakers and really let them just speak to their own culture and their own history.
Okay, so well, what would you say? I mean, for me, when I teach graphic design, the department already had a text, which is Meg's. So I try to use that as the structure, like the jumping board for me, as like it has a skeleton there, but then I keep adding a lot of things to it. So I include my designers, the people that I think they're important, the movements. I add resources, and then towards the end, if you're all familiar with Meg's, it goes from history, really, the narrative, to list. So we have like lists and lists of designers after designers, and just for the sake of them being there, we have them. So I change it a little bit, but I use it as the structure to just have all of these points. Any thoughts on that? How do you approach your?
Well, the idea of connectivity really resonates with me. I think that's something that I emphasize to the students, is that this is a huge, in a way, they could be connected through a timeline, through nodal structures, through trees, through sort of like starting in one place and finding others, and that all of these different structures show us different things. So as you all are speaking, that makes me think of how sort of each person has these different lenses through which these structures make sense to them. I love it when the students are able to show and connect things that they're interested in, or things that they've either found or been curious about in their lives, what might seem like in very not designed places, and to see how it comes alive by looking at it through a graphic design lens.
That's wonderful, yes. I actually would like to open up to questions if anyone wants to ask us questions. So I'm not the only person asking questions. So if
I
anyone.
have a question.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I did not choose the text. It was chosen for me, and it is Meg's History of Graphic Design. I struggle with that text because it is really more of a reference. It's like an encyclopedia. And I asked the question early on in this, in the chat. I'd love to know what other books people are using. So far, I've heard everybody pretty much in agreement that you're using Meg's. I would like to know how you're using it. What is your expectation? What are the students expected to walk away with knowing at the end of the semester? Because it is overwhelming. I mean, the amount of information in that book. And I struggle with, well, what do I want them to know? And when I'm hearing you guys say, you expect them to choose what they're going to know, kind of. Like what's important to them. Well, how do you coordinate that with the text? That's my big struggle here.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, just so for my experience, I haven't used Meg's. I remember Meg's from my undergrad, but in the last, and I'm definitely a baby graphic design history teacher. This is my third year teaching a class exclusively about this topic. I adopted the text, The Graphic Design History, A Critical Guide by Drucker and McVarish, which I found to be a really great structure to start with, and certainly as someone who's just starting, that felt like both something that feels comprehensive, feels like it's sort of anchoring, perhaps in the way that Meg's is also able to be that, but I also felt like it was a really great sort of like way to seed in their readings and pair or sort of make triads of readings along the way. So using the text as kind of a spine, and then bringing in contemporary references, or perhaps connected ideas from different cultures or different time periods. Which is to say that I think I think for me, I think that atomized approach as it came. And got a question. So the book I just mentioned is Graphic Design History, A Critical Guide by Joanna Drucker and Emily McVarish. Maybe some of the others in the audience and the panel have used that too. But one thing it well as sort of bring maybe sort of summarize these sort of like sections with timelines and key terms that in a way for a student, especially for perhaps a sophomore or junior, sort of like beginning their vocabulary and practice in design, is able to kind of see these connections between social history, technology, and media, and begin to kind of extract both the combinations and collaborations in those different spaces.
One thing I found that students relate to is vernacular design, and that's something that's really overlooked in design history studies, and yet it's the stuff that we're surrounded with, it's the stuff that defines the look of whatever era you're living in. And by bringing in that kind of stuff, like, you know, World War II coupon ration books, like everybody had one in their house, right? Everybody knew what that looked like. It kind of takes the academic thing off the study of history, which many students find to be kind of a burden. Like nobody likes history, and it breaks my heart because I love it, you know? And I think that by bringing in vernacular items of design, you also make it slightly less elitist. Like, this is the way we design and this is what we study. And I just don't buy it, you know? Even comics, you know, comics are just, and graphic novels now, like, you can see so much about other cultures from that kind of work. So I feel like bringing in that stuff is kind of a sneaky way to make it more alive for students. I mean, they still have to know the basics, right? But we have to, I think, open it up to other things that are in their world too.
So I have kind of given up on textbooks entirely. And I think we've had a lot more fun since then. If I were required to require one, I would tell my students on the first day that it was a suggested text, right? I wouldn't make them buy it, and I probably wouldn't make them read any of it. It can be the suggested text, sure, whatever. But I think using just a very, very generalized chronological backbone for the structure of the course, and then branching out from there in kind of networked ways, can be really, really effective. So for instance, the last time I taught graphic design history, we moved roughly chronologically. We started off looking at global manuscript cultures. We looked at early printing technologies, not all of them typographic. We looked at the Industrial Revolution. We moved through modernism. We got to kind of the 21st century. And within that, all of the students had to have a topic that they were interested in exploring. So is it feminist design? As an example of this, in the comments, I am going to post the published work that one of the students in this class did last year. So hi, Dina. Everyone should take a look at what does a feminist graphic design history in the United States look like on the Alphabet site. Students are interested in sustainability or political activism. And so every week they find an image example that connects their interest to whatever the sort of chronological topic is: manuscripts, printing, modernism as a quote global idea. And they dig in. So yeah, it's very responsive to things that they're interested in, but at the same time, I do give a little bit of a structure because the world is a very large place. So moving roughly chronologically kind of helps narrow our focus. We don't address everything, we can't.
One thing I want to mention, going back to the question of who are our students, some of our students may be design majors. A lot of our students may be design majors. That is a required course for them. And in my case, a lot of my students are Gen Ed students that they are from all different majors. So this would be their first encounter with graphic design and history of graphic design. So what I do is to mix in a little bit of the practice for them. So it would be the first time they're doing this, is because they don't have any art classes or any studio classes. It's with every topic that I introduce, I do like a little small design project, a very simple design project. And I found that that they all really enjoyed it, and it just made sense to them when we were talking about a topic and they did that little small project. They fell in love with it. Some of them were like, I couldn't take the paper away from them because they still wanted to like draw something or like design a logo. So that helped me a lot along with doing the graphic design history, especially for non-major students. Any similar experiences? Any other little things that we can add to our teaching?
I'd like to ask another question, if I may.
Oh, sure.
So I would just like to hear from, again, those of you that have many years of experience, because like Lisa, I am newer in the last couple of years to teaching graphic design history. What is your ratio of like quiz versus essay versus design projects?
The students don't like writing lately.
Right, exactly.
So I've stopped giving tests. I just have them write. And I have them write about images, which helps because they love images. We all love images.
I have them write a manifesto at the end of the class. Cool. So I make them study other manifestos, and I have to explain the difference between a rant and a manifesto, because like I used to get a lot of rants until I explained that, you know. I also think that they do respond mostly to images, and that by having them write about images, you give them sort of a springboard into the stuff that hopefully they've learned that semester. You know, they respond to that in a different way.
Yeah, I think I've been teaching graphic design for a long time, and our students need to write. The quality of writing has slowly descended for the years, and I'd like to know why, you know, what's happening in their build up to college, the college experience, that their writing has not remained as robust as it used to be. So I do think just in general, writing and critiquing their writing and having them critique their writing to kind of help them understand how important writing is throughout their lives and their careers and their ability to express themselves both verbally and through writing. Yeah, I don't do a lot of testing. I think getting them to talk, getting them to be able to convey their ideas, and then being able to also write in various forms is just more important to me than the testing.
Would any of you be willing to share one of your writing rubrics on graphic design essays?
Sure.
Just to add, I think one thing about our graphic design history class is it comes as a required course their first semester as a sophomore. So fall first semester sophomore, they're taking graphic design history amongst their other studio courses, and they're all graphic design majors at KCAI. And what I love about that is also that it sort of sets up a foundation for thinking and responding and thinking about design and reading about it. I think there are a couple of comments that, you know, to be a good writer is to be, you know, good writer is to read, right? And the more you read, the more things one reads, the more kinds of ways that you are able to sort of express what it is that you are speaking or thinking about. And I think that thinking aloud and that sharing of what you're thinking aloud with other students is something that we definitely try to foster across the 3 years. And way writing is a tool that we want each of our students to come away with. So definitely tests, but a lot of reflective writing and reflective assessment of their own thinking, the way they're connecting their work and what they're seeing.
I definitely asked them to write a research paper, a short research paper, but I assigned a research topic to them. So they are not all over everything, and it's aimed at them, it's specific, and I get the better result out of it because they're more focused, and that makes them to write, to read, and research. So that serves my purpose for like them learning what I want them to learn.
I'm sorry, I'm running in a little bit late. I'm just curious if anybody's broached this subject yet. I've been teaching history of graphic design or communication design in one form or another for about 19 years. And lately I've been getting pretty tremendous pushback from colleagues who have PhDs in art history. And I don't have a PhD in art history. I've got advanced degrees in other disciplines, but the way that, I don't know, I've been doing it, sorry, I know that doesn't sound very humble, seems to work really well for our students, but I teach lecture sections of about 140 to 180 students with a couple of TAs helping. And one of the things that I have them write almost every week. They have 3 major papers a semester, but I've invited our art history faculty to come into my lecture classes just to kind of see what's going on, and we're flipping them, and there's lots of dialogue, and I'm finding that their dialogue, and the more that they get into small groups and take notes from each other, it really helps improve their writing. So, and serving as editors for each other really helps do that too. And I thought Lisa made a great point a few moments ago when she talked about the importance of reading. I would add to that, I encourage students as they read, use these things. I realize a lot of students want to read things online, that's fine, but use your highlighter tool, whether it's the manual old-fashioned kind that you hold in your hand or the one that's in something and with a red pen. But the more effectively you can learn to read critically, the more you can learn to write. And I'll finish by saying, as a journal editor, even at graduate level, we see lots and lots, unfortunately, of really, really bad writing. And I think one of the places across design to deal with this up front is at the undergraduate level. And Lisa, as others have talked about, you know, hopefully you can get your students in a comm design history class earlier rather than later in their curriculums.
You know, one of the things that I always emphasize to my students is that they need a graphic design library. Like if you look at the Zoom backgrounds here, look at all the books, right? And I started building a little one for our program. And one of my students said to me, we don't like to read. And I feel like saying, well, that's why you don't like to write. Like you need those 2 things, you need those skills, you know? So I keep pushing it, and I hope that maybe 1 or 2 of them will hear it. But you know, this is the culture that we're up against, where we read on our phone. You know, that's it. And books are a pain in the neck, and they're heavy, and we have to move and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, I keep saying, you know, it's not the same reading on a screen. It's just not the same, you know? And so you need both. I'm not saying I hate the digital world. I love it, but I feel like you need both.
I have found actually that you can, those students who are really engaged, if I bring in books and I hug them and I say, oh, this is my favorite book, I love this design book, and I want to share it with you. I think the more we kind of show a love of books and a love of why a book is such a precious thing, that does seem to rub off on some of them, not all of them, but some of them who are really engaged start to want to have a library or bring in a book to show me, look what I bought this, you know, this great design book. And I think that kind of trying to create some energy around books as well in the classroom does seem to make them want to be sort of part of that culture.
Yeah, and to show that we're excited about it. I think Danielle Fushi just said, you know, like to share what it is that's been exciting to you, and make that a part of the dialogue, that a part of what our work is, also as practitioners, as educators, as researchers, and then as we visit archives or places via online or physically, to show how exciting it was to see something in person, and to show that vibrancy in connecting a new idea, or connecting ideas that you've always had but have never seen at the same time.
So there was a point of like, are we experts? What is it that we all have to know? How do you all feel about that? Like, are we designers, educators, researchers, scholars, historians?
I think many of the I think I come to the classroom being open. I don't know all of it. I was not, and that is okay. In a way, I'm excited that I don't know all of it yet, because I'm going to be experiencing something too. But I do know that I know some amount, and then I know I can start there, but I know that can be reshaped as well, and hopefully over the semester, you know, knowing that should be able to move, and that it's mutable.
Angela, what's your approach?
Well, we can't know everything, right? But we should know what we don't know, and then we should call in, the troops. Basically, we're starting a new curriculum at University of the Arts for the graphic design program, and the first semester of the sophomore type class is going to cover world languages as well as immersive media and stuff like that. And I know a little bit about, designing type and typography in other languages, but I don't know enough, and I'm going to say that I don't know this. So we're going to have guest lecturers. I'm going to find hopefully the helpful readings so that the students will have an idea of how, calligraphy has functioned around the world, how movable type started in Asia, not necessarily Gutenberg, which is how most people are taught it started, right? So I think that, just having the humble approach and saying, you know what, I don't know everything. I mean, you learn from your students every day. One of them once told me that he felt colonized by having to read something that Steve Heller wrote. And I just thought, well, there's something else I have to be aware of. You just don't know. So.
Dori, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I added in the comments that if I think of myself as an expert at anything, it's finding things out, right? Like there's so much we don't know. I'm a teacher because that's the only way I can afford to keep going to school and learning new things forever. And I always share that with my students. So yeah, there are research skills that are very helpful in assisting you to find new information that you haven't encountered before, and figuring out ways to share those strategies with students and introduce them to all kinds of resources, not just printed books, which are amazing artifacts that I hug in front of my class as well, but the amazing digital resources that are available to us that are often a lot more accessible, particularly to students who are geographically or financially challenged in some way. Other people, like connecting with guest lecturers, like a lot of folks are suggesting in the group chat, public libraries, the everyday physical world around us. Can't say enough times, digital archives. And there are ways to help our students figure out how to find all of this good stuff. And that's what we should be sharing with them, I think, because everyone has a different area of interest or things that they need to know about. In 15 weeks, we cannot have a comprehensive global survey that teaches everything, but we can introduce lots and lots of tools for making the story bigger and contextualizing the story.
I think for our institution, the Black Lives Matter movement has really sparked a lot of conversation this summer about the fact that, most of us, our own education really was a very Western approach to graphic design, and all of the heroes and the people that we kind of know as the benchmarks of the growth of graphic design really has to change. I mean, it just helped us to kind of think more broadly about, kind of based on this discussion of broadening the conversation to a more global understanding of, how design has progressed in other parts of the world, and bringing in just a broader scope. And it's really helped us to start thinking about, right, the things we don't know. This is how we were educated, but it doesn't mean we should be just passing on that as the next generation. We need to expand our knowledge, and that really helped us to kind of start that conversation. And already, thinking about the next semester, so changing up my curriculum to try to broaden that scope. And again, saying to the students, I don't know everything, but this is where I'm starting to make that a broader conversation.
Well, I think circling back to what you said about like the design of the Black Lives Matter movement, like we have a whole unit on the design of protest. And so I introduced the students to the Black Panthers. I mean, they had a minister of design. They actually had a really coherent design strategy. And so for the students, that kind of gives them like that moment where they're like, oh wait, this isn't just happening now. It's also happened earlier. And this is what it looked like then, and this is what it looks like now. And it just gives them, I think, another way into it. that doesn't feel academic, that feels more lived to them.
And that there's always been multiple ways, multiple doors into these. Was so few, and perhaps that's, you know, I can certainly that's about history. And I was not, I have not always been a history nerd, and which is to say, I think I'm still growing into one. But I think when it looked like there was just sort of line and some stories and some people involved, it did not feel connected. But to know that there are many sort of strange backgrounds and back roads and back doors and windows, and just different ways to cut into it. If we can show that even if it's, you know, a 3-hour module in one class, if it's not its own course on history, show that some version of it, and to see that even example slices can help you open up the references that you might have.
I think based on what you said, all of these parallel histories and various voices, I think with a project like a timeline and calling the experts and individuals who have knowledge of that specific topic or era or history, that will really help us. Because, for example, I can contribute about Iranian graphic design. I can include people that I think they must be included. And it goes for everyone in their own culture, in their own expertise, to add to that timeline. So when we're referring our students to a source like that, it's more comprehensive and relevant. So I agree that it has to be like all like from all strands that we put together and weave this whole history together.
I mean, you know, history is a story, it's a narrative, and it varies very much by who's telling it and what's their motive. And I think it's instructive for students to sort of know that from the beginning, to get comfortable with the ambiguity, and to encourage them to explore, you know, the history of design from these sometimes opposing viewpoints. I think you said yesterday, you know, we call Alexander the Great great, but to the people he conquered, they didn't find him so great, you know. So.
Is anyone familiar with the People's Graphic Design Archive?
Yeah.
I found out about it.
It's a great resource. I've been adding to it, and I plan to have my students do research and add to it this fall. The website is the People's GD Archive.
Yeah, one thing I love about that is, I think in a recent conversation with some other design historians, you know, the lens of technology, the lens of social history. I mean, these things are we can use them and make them alive within these archives to share the way that we see these things. And such a huge team of people who have put that together. Even if everyone on this call right now added one, I bet we could all find really different things that could add to that archive and truly expand, you know, maybe on that vernacular level, on that daily level, you know, what things have never been in a textbook, because that's not what we published. Even the nature of publishing is what also sort of commanded what could be published, or what needed, how thought through or how agreed upon those words or thoughts are. We are living in a space where there's so many different ways that we can make what it is that we're thinking. And so we can take advantage of that.
I think we have 15 more minutes. Do you want to break up to groups, or do you want to keep the conversation going? It's all up to you guys. How do you want to do it?
I'm liking the conversation.
Okay, so we continue. And then we can continue this whole conversation in Slack, in the threads and the channels that are there. And you always have time to include your ideas. Okay, so yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
I had a question. Also, former Philip Meggs student, which is kind of interesting to hear y'all talk about him. But and Iranian. I'm kind of curious as to, you know, we talk about making sure that we include a multifaceted history, but I'm curious as to like how big that goes, and as it goes, you know, it gets larger and larger, and you expand that timeline more and more and more. How diluted do you end up making the content? And is it that you end up fixating on like certain key things and are just like, well, here's a giant list, you know, for students, but it seems like that's also a problem with Meggs's history to some degree.
I think that's a great question, and that's when the experts come in, because when you're a historian of, for example, Iranian graphic design, you definitely know who are the key people that shifted kind of like the course of the design history in that era or that culture. So that is when the expert view comes in, and you can really like narrow it down and emphasize on certain movements or people and include it. So that's why I really emphasize on who's telling us the story and what is the story that you're getting. And it should be from someone who's really like, they know the culture and the history. That's how I deal with it.
Thank you.
Okay.
I would say that I'm a bit uncomfortable with the word expert when I answer that question. I do think that scholarship is important, right? That spending time and digging deep has rewards that a quick glance will never let us arrive at. So scholarship and time, yes. Expert.
Was he really?
That's tricky.
He was in New Jersey.
Yeah, sorry, feedback. And I like to try to help my students understand, again, that there is no way that we are going to cover everything. No, there's not a canon of global design history. No, a survey course can't do it all. There are so many stories that haven't been told yet. The ones that have been told over and over and over are really easy to find, frankly. And I point my students toward that. It's helpful knowledge. But there are so many things that we can find out, and there are so many things that we can ask questions about. And that's where I try to get my students to focus.
Yeah, I think that really comes down to the instilling curiosity. Our students, a lot of my students come from an education system where they're fed information and they're really not taught to be curious people. And I think they come to college and a lot of times they're sort of thrown into this this desire of faculty to have them be self-learners, but they haven't been taught to be self-learners. They haven't been taught to be proactive in their learning. And so they really, have to somehow be instilled with this desire to ask questions, ask why, and do their own research, or kind of based on what you were just saying is that, right, we can't teach everything, but hopefully it inspires you to go out and do some looking yourself and maybe bring that back to the rest of us.
Maybe I should rephrase the experts then. I should probably say informed contributors. And I had in the comments here, having students as contributors. And that would be a great idea because, for example, if I want to cover Chinese design, I would need the help of an informed contributor, an informed person in that culture to add to my knowledge about that specific design. That's what I meant, really. So maybe I should rephrase the expert.
I think, and to connect that, Roshanak, with Dori, what you said earlier is to learn how to find out and to know that there's an amount that you can know. There's an amount that you can come through talking to others, and there's an amount you never know, and that's okay too. And to be able to identify that and be excited the fact that what you can access with getting good at searching, getting good at finding, and knowing that each of us is able to do that, and all of our students. I mean, we're essentially kind of like a small research lab, right? When we're all working together, whether it's a project or a paper or a timeline that we're making together, it's a lab, and that lab creates, and part of what it creates. All of the things that come in the room, right? 18 years plus, times 25 or 100 or 18 or students you have in your class. That's how much lived experience you have in the room. What is that room made out of? And to be able to ask and to know that that's a knowledge base that you can all share together. I know that felt particularly palpable to me, I think, not quite 10 years ago, but I was teaching at Queens College, CUNY, New York City, and was such a, you know, it was a big contrast from other schools I had taught, and it was in part because I realized like how much was in that room and how much we could, I needed to dig in differently. I feel that acknowledging that the students are in fact very valuable resources for another, and to talk about that, to say that. I think saying these things out, saying that we're also saying that we're learning, saying that we're inspired by others, naming each other, you know, those of us perhaps inspired by others in the room here, to say that, you know, we're amongst others, and this community of history learning is now that part of these students' lives too.
Angela?
I think it's important that we kind of encourage students to ask the right questions. To me, that's what really feeds their curiosity the most. I had a guest speaker once who came in and said that he would give students an assignment to design a clock, and they would only have like an hour to do it. And they all did something, like some of them had numbers and some of them were digital and some of them were round and whatever. But not one student challenged the idea that time is, you know, 60 seconds per minute, 60 minutes per hour, 24 hours in the day. Not one of them looked at that and took that apart and made a clock for that. And I was really struck by that, because I myself would not have thought to ask that question. But I think if we can encourage students to take that kind of, well, just because we've all said this our whole lives, does that mean it's right? I think that approach really helps them kind of dig into research questions for sure.
Dori, what do you think?
Yeah, so last time I taught design history to first year students who weren't design majors, and last time I taught design history to juniors and seniors and grad students who were design majors. We used kind of the same fundamental approach where everyone had a research focus and they were sharing resources with each other. And so I wasn't the expert driving these conversations. Everyone wanted to learn more about their topic and they shared resources with each other. And yes, I mean, I've probably read a whole lot more than many of my students. And so by dropping in on all of these conversations and saying, hey, have you seen this? This is an amazing resource. You would love it. That could help them discover things that they may not have encountered before.
Great. So are there any questions from our participants?
I had another question, actually.
Sure.
So when we're talking about, you know, the need to instill passion in research, I was curious as to how you encourage that, because in my experience with students, I can get them to research an individual designer and look at their work and say, hey, it looks like you're into this kind of thing. Here are 3 designers that do similar stuff, but to get them to research an entire movement or the causations or restrictions, like for example, if we're talking about punk rock photocopied flyers, you know, the restriction of the materials that they have access to is partially, you know, the motivation for the way that those things are, you know, built. I'll mute myself.
Yeah, I mean, what I hear is the motivation is part of the context of that work, and part of, and some things that we can know, and some things that we sort of have stories and sort of speculations. I think sort of connecting students and our motivations with what it is that we're making and doing, and try to show those cycles maybe in a contemporary way, and sort of see, you know, how that might sort of like feed the way that we imagine how those motivation cycles and, you know, and technology that affected what those wants to communicate looked like at that time. So I don't know. So I think part of it is maybe, yeah, combining the more contemporary or things that feel closer with things that might feel farther away, when really it's sort of like one of the same kind of neural family of work and connection.
Any other questions?
A lot of folks have been talking about methods. It would be amazing to have sort of a round table discussion at some point on methods for doing research in graphic design. That would be fun.
It'd be wonderful, yes. I had someone look like that they had a question. Anyone? I just saw someone.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hello, my name's Kelly Walters. I teach at Parsons. I have a question just about how people are handling design work historical design work that deals with racial stereotypes and kind of connecting the dots to intent. Like what and how are people maybe working through that?
Lisa, Dori, Angela.
One thing that I did when I most recently taught history was look at the W.E.B. Du Bois. There's a series of articles about his infographics about Black lives in Georgia around the turn of the century. And I made the conscious decision that we were going to look at that instead of showing extraordinarily negative racial stereotypes. Yeah, Silas Munro's introduction to those infographics is amazing. And yes, I have read portions of that aloud to my students. So I agonized over that decision, right? Like, am I going to assign one of our 15 weeks to this question of race in America in a way that focuses on stereotyping, or are we going to try to push the conversation past that in some way? I'm still not sure how I feel about the decision that I made, to be completely honest. But I added resources to my syllabus for, finding out more and being more critical of stereotyping.
I think Monroe's book is a strong starting point. I think one of the things to talk about there, and I've used it too, with Du Bois, I go right from Du Bois and explaining that the reason why he designed those informational graphics was to change public policy in the state of Georgia. And I think having students see, to answer Kelly's terrific question, that design is a means to affect, and that's the way, it's my whole approach to the way I teach the history of comm design at UNT. How does design affect, and how is design affected by social, technological, economic, environmental, and political policy change factors, whatever you want to call them. So connecting, Du Bois' intent in designing those was to change what was happening in the Georgia state legislature in terms of how land was being allocated. I mean, 40 acres and a mule went out the window in Georgia with Reconstruction. Du Bois was trying to use the legal means that he had at his disposal, was trying to make a case for something. So I think it's great to show students that. I jumped right from there to using the Ebony and the Jet archives. I don't know how many people use those, Jet Magazine and Ebony Magazine. They've recently opened their archives. Those are in Chicago. And I think, getting back to Kelly's question too, I try to show some of the Ebony and the Jet material from, say, the 60s and the 70s, used to promote, golly, anything from toothpaste to skin cream to what have you, to what was appearing in more mainstream media that was coming out of the big ticket advertising agencies. McDonald's is a really good compare and contrast from that particular period of time. So I don't know if John Jennings is in on this call or not. He's done some really interesting work out at UC Riverside on this. He and I and Eric Benson wrote a paper that looked at this a little bit a few years ago that we pushed into dialectic. So there are some resources out there, but sorry, I'm talking too long. Kelly, I think a lot more work needs to be done in this area. There's a lot more that needs to be added to the canon.
I think showing as much, I think for me, the way that I tackled that both with some of the example with Dubois text, amazing also. For example, with World War II war, a lot of really awful imagery of Asian people, specifically Japanese people, and the language around that. I think that is a point in history within the graphic design to show that yeah, there's a lot that's in, like, there's so many things are buried inside of things, and that every object sort of is filled with assumptions, opinions, thoughts, and maybe assumed sort of like collective understanding of people and places and the otherness of those people and places. I think as I also I think for myself trying to understanding and contextualizing that work and knowing that for feeling that kind of weight of sort of like visual oppression perhaps is what is happening in so many other spots, and kind of almost like these sort of like hot spots that need to be that I need to be better at knowing more about history, like, you know, for not forget typography, but just like what actually happened, like what kinds of maybe history readings or other kinds of texts need to be brought into the work as supplemental or as suggested readings to be able to give entrance points for students. I think the last time I taught graphic design history, we talked about, you know, what was the Vietnam War, like what was going on? And it's like, oh my gosh, we don't have that vocabulary in this room. Okay, that's fine. Let's talk about that. So needing to take a step back and sort of open it up and say, okay, like when in the time are we talking about? Who are these people? What led up to that? And, you know, that's a lot of work from us, and certainly it's in a way outside of the, you know, the canon of graphic design or history of graphic design, but it's absolutely inside and integral to place these objects that can just seem like, you know, they seem so big, but they were just one little fleck, you know, in the midst of a huge sort of, you know, pool or cesspool of these many things. And I think we need to struggle with that. We need to be uncomfortable and show and talk about how it's uncomfortable and how it was uncomfortable then as it is now. It's not that it was ever really okay. It was always hurting someone.
Angela, do you want to share with us how do you approach it?
That is such a great point that Lisa just made, is that it's always uncomfortable. And I just acknowledge that whenever we're talking about that kind of subject. It's just like, you know what, look, somebody in this room is not going to feel comfortable with this. That doesn't mean it's not safe. It doesn't mean we can't talk about it. You know, that this is how we progress, right? Part of the way we've approached this is to have a lecture about typefaces and racist typefaces. And you say, well, how can a typeface be racist? But if you look at some of them, like there's a fake Asian font called Chop Suey that Fresh Direct was using in ads as recently as like 5 years ago. There are lots of fake Hebrew fonts. I think there's one called Circumcision, seriously. And, you know, you look at what that says and who is that for and who is using it and what are they using it for? And it opens up the conversation from this very little starting point to a much, much, much broader net that seems to sort of up the comfort level a little bit in having the conversation in the first place.
I think that was also interesting that Lisa brought up the generation of our student that we're dealing with, and we cannot assume that they know all of these historical facts. So we always have to put in all of that information for them, even about designers. A lot of them don't know who Milton Glaser is. So it's like you have to find a way to weave everything into that in terms of history, like what you were saying about Vietnam War. Like Beatles, I'm asking them, do you know Beatles? And they're like, who? So I think that's a great point of reminding ourselves that these are young students that we're dealing with, and they don't have that background that we assume they have.
You guys are making me think of another question about being uncomfortable. How are you guys dealing with situations? This was a big topic at CAA in February among the design historians, most of whom were coming from PhD backgrounds in design history. How do you guys deal with so for so long, design history has been rooted in the study and the analysis of artifacts and sort of what surrounds them. What happens when the result of the design process is not an artifact, but it's a different way of doing something? I think we're getting there. I mean, I'll go back to the question Kelly posed a few moments ago. When the goal of the design process is to change public policy, like W.E.B. Du Bois and the graphic design team at the Black Panthers were trying to do, or you're trying to change a technology, or you're trying to change an economic reality or something like that. That's real uncomfortable space to deal with too. And that also touches on what some of you have raised with the issue of our students are indeed, for the most part, so young.
I have my students study the contemporary. There's a new high-rise with an international food hall in our neighborhood. The students hang out there. I have them go and deconstruct, in a way, the cultures that they know and that they don't know, to find things that, even if they understand the culture, may not understand inherent symbolism that either is correct or incorrect. They bring it back to the classroom and they talk about it. It's a way for them to look at these everyday life with a more critical eye, but it also introduces some of these things that other students may never have questions, like someone had talked about the chop suey typeface. Are these things hurtful, or how do they become our contemporary symbols? And what will the students do in the future when they tend to use this type of symbolism to identify something specific?
Anyone else? Any other questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think the back to the question of when the work is not a thing, or even a group of things distributed, but something else is distributed. Whether it's a sort of like a sense of a sense that there is no thing. I suppose in that sense, that maybe that's part of whenever the new graphic design history text or textbooks or whatever it is, these resources that we need to be able to maybe be better at talking about what those things are. Does that make us need to collaborate with social sciences more, or social historians more closely? Maybe it transitions from being a graphic design sort of, artifact, even if it's a sense. In a way, an artifact can be an intangible object, I suppose. And sort of transitions into another field, and that's our responsibility to remember that that's where those thoughts are, and we need to sort of connect or make better those connections, so that we're not speaking, too simply or too sort of like too much in summary.
Yeah, when I was putting my course reader, which was really just a series of open access links to articles together last time I taught, I concentrated a lot on, number one, scholarship by women and scholars of color, and number two, on introducing students to the variety of fields that are connected to design history research. So articles that are talking about things that we as designers might call design, but from a social sciences perspective, or a strictly historical perspective, or an economic perspective, or a history of technology perspective. And again, there was no way for us to cover everything. I had to leave so many things out, it hurt. But again, introducing students to asking those questions and consulting sources that they might not have thought about the first time around. Like, would you automatically think to read an article by an economic historian? Maybe not, but why not?
Yeah, I saw Ramon raising his hand. Did you have a question?
Actually not a question, but just a thought. I'm Ramon, and I teach at RISD, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so some of the things about, just because this has been a topic dear and near to me, and I taught history 2 years ago last time. But I mean, a lot of this to me is just, we're teaching a lot of our students, I mean, at least for RISD, for anywhere I've taught. I also taught at Queens College for many years. Lisa mentioned that earlier. And those student bodies are very different. And we have a lot of students who come from different places, and we're constantly hitting at this graphic design history. What we're talking about is literally about 150 years of pretty much European and some Americans, 2 women, half a person of color history. So like, you know, we have to be really cognizant that right now students don't see themselves, and how we frame that is incredibly important. So I think we have to be super, super, super careful. I also think like when we use the word critical, we have to remember that like, we have students that come from cultures where being critical is not a value. Okay, like my immigrant Hispanic parents, the idea of me being critical of anything of the American government is like, are you serious? That's a huge conversation to take home. So like, you know, like I know we like to bat around like, oh yay, we're being critical, we're teaching you criticality. Hold on. Like it's really problematic, which leads to students not being comfortable in the classroom a lot of the times. And I also think the idea of like teaching history, I mean, I did not use a textbook. I will dare not ever use a textbook again, regardless. There's so many problems. Even the newer books to me, it's the same story, it just repackaged differently. We have a lot of really good writers, really people that know how to write really well and can frame a story, but I have several of them here. I've read them, it's the same story. It's just repackaged, and that's, you know, perfect, fine. But I'm also thinking about like, you know, this requires a whole other kind of thing to think about and thinking about them. But I think it's really important that we sort of really think where we're coming from and where our students are coming from. And a lot of us are coming from being taught in sort of what I would argue is a mode of teaching that maybe it's outdated and has run its course. And part of the challenge is how do we shift, into this other way of looking at things and being more open, and sort of like collaborate more on this, lose some of this vocabulary, you know, fundamentals, basic, all of that. I mean, that's just, you know, sometimes very problematic for some students to deal with some of that language that design and, you know, traffics in. And I think we just really, really, really need to think about that. And I would also argue who a student needs to know to be a successful person, a successful designer, a successful whatever, that's up for grabs. So if I make a course and I introduce you to, you know, like 300 people that don't look like you, you know, I don't know. Good luck with that. So just some thoughts on what I've been hearing in the conversation.
Thank you so much. I think we're almost running out of time. I would like to thank you all for being here and joining. We will definitely continue the conversation. Please put your comments in the threads and the channels, and we'll be all in touch, hopefully. Okay, thank you all for being here. Lisa, Angela, and Dori, thank you all.